Right, our first item is a discussion of the district's draft planning guidance policy to protect and enhance bay shoreline areas of San Mateo County. This represents a tremendous amount of work by the staff, and know that you've given a lot of thought and attention, and we're looking forward to your presentation.
Okay, thank you. So I will start off and I will pass it over to Kenna Wong, our project manager. And she will pass it off to Kelly Beggs, who just sat down. Kelly is a consultant that worked on this with Kenna over the past few months. And Kelly's joined by one of the firm's managers, Aaron Hacknam. And the firm is Bid City Company, and we hired them to help with this project. And we're very excited to have this launched as a draft. And to have this board meeting. I would say since the district was created, there are probably three major milestones that we spent a lot of time on. And the first of those was setting up the district and its finances and becoming an independent financial agency. And that was something that Lucy worked very hard on in the first year and a half of our existence. And the second one, I would say, is completing construction of the Bayfront Canal project. And that's something that Colin worked with me hard on for a couple of years. And so this is the third kind of signature milestone so far. And this is one that McKenna worked on, and that's getting this draft out. So I'll go through slides for a few minutes and then turn it over to McKenna. So the first question I thought we'd answer today is why develop a planning guidance policy and why now? There's an interesting statistic that the California Department of Water Resources put out about the three driest years being followed by the three wettest weeks on record, three driest years on record, followed by the three wettest weeks. And in San Mateo County, of course, that scenario was no different. And it was no different in 2021, not just in the last 4 months. In 2021, we had two atmospheric rivers that provided about 3/4 of our rainfall for the whole year, and 3 times the amount of rainfall in 2020. And so we see this as a new normal. Obviously, every year will be slightly different, but we should at least plan for this eventuality on an ongoing basis from now on. And so getting to the question of why a planning guidance policy, our core planning documents, general plans, specific plans, zoning ordinances, they don't take into account this new normal or any real aspect of the new normal. And we think that they should. Because if that doesn't change, then the new developments that are intended to function for several decades under this regime, let's say, of the environment, won't be resilient to those conditions. And that we will need to retrofit them and to both protect those developments, but also protect areas around them, the so-called regional resilience. And why now? Because there are a lot of developments that are being proposed right now that are going to have a long-lasting impact. And resilience is one of the many questions that we should be asking, we meaning collectively, all of our communities, one of the many questions along with traffic and other environmental effects and things like that. So that's why now. It's because there's a lot that's moving forward that will lock in what our bay looks like in the future. And that was mentioned by Gita in one of the public comments that there's one of those developments is one that's in Redwood Shores. Okay, so let's see if I can advance the slide. Okay, so more about the kind of why now. If we look at the historic average sea level rise, and this is not a year-to-year number, this is really a growth in the water level of the bay relative to 1895, we see that over the past approximately 125 years, the bay water level has risen about 8 inches, and that's about 1 inch every 15.5 years. And if we look at the projections, and it's the intermediate scenario projection from the National Oceanic and Atmospheric Administration in a report that they concluded last year, the rate of increase goes from 1 inch every 15.5 years to about 1 inch every 3.8 years. And I say it's an intermediate scenario. It's not the most aggressive scenario in regards to carbon emissions and warming of the atmosphere and the resulting expansion of the ocean and the reduction of ice sheets in Antarctica and all those kinds of impacts from carbon emissions. And so it's not the most kind of scary scenario, and it's not the least scary scenario. It's what NOAA calls their intermediate scenario. And this is for the Bay water level. So more on why develop planning guidance policy. We wanted to look at what was the state of planning as it exists today, and one of the tasks that Good City produced for us is on the left, and that is for all of the Bayside cities that we looked at in this document, and those are the 12 Bayside cities. So the 11 that actually touch the Bay shoreline, plus San Bruno that's impacted by the Bay, pretty substantially in the Bel Air neighborhood especially. And so those are the 12 Bayside cities, and those are listed in the document in the agenda report. So Good City looked at, okay, for those 12 cities, what are the current land uses? And here's just an example for Burlingame and East Palo Alto. Two very different cities, of course. And one of the differences is that Burlingame is largely commercial and industrial in the areas that could be or would be impacted by sea level rise. And East Palo Alto certainly has commercial and industrial and quite a bit of proposed commercial right now. But there's also a lot of housing. And so that influences how we look at this issue and how we become resilient to the issue. There are different treatments for housing than there is for commercial and industrial. We also looked at what are the vulnerabilities of our communities in these same areas. And there's something called the Federal Social Vulnerability Index that looks at income and housing and ethnicity, and overlaid that with the sea level rise impact area or overlay zone. And not surprising, a lot of the areas that are most at risk of flooding, including flooding from this issue, are in the higher levels of social vulnerability in the index. And then finally, we looked at, and this is something we touched on at the last board meeting, we looked at the proposals by cities to comply with their regional housing needs allocation numbers, or so-called RHNA numbers, and where those proposals are sitting. 43% of all proposed units in the cities that we looked at are proposed for the floodplain, current or future floodplain. 38% of affordable housing units are proposed in the floodplain. As we've talked about before, there are a lot of pressures on jurisdictions to comply with RHNA numbers and to make housing more affordable. And so for us, it's not whether you build, but it's whether you build with resilience in mind. And so we encourage, through this document and through our engagement with cities, we encourage building with resilience in mind. Okay. So the road to the planning guidance policy, how did we get here? In 2021, little less than 2 years ago, we reached out to the Georgetown Climate Center, which is part of the Georgetown Law School. And that was then the recommendation a long time ago of Debbie Reddick, if you remember that. And that really started us on this journey, which was great. They have a really great program that's a clearinghouse or a repository for local government information regarding climate resilience. And so we learned a lot from them, and we got in touch with jurisdictions around the country. We've listed the primary ones here that we gleaned information from: Boston, Broward County is in Florida, Hawaii is island and county in Hawaii, Norfolk, Virginia, New York City, and Rhode Island. Rhode Island is interesting because they do planning at the state level. It's obviously a small state and they can do that, but there's a lot of kind of history to that as well, and they are doing a lot in climate and sea level rise resilience. So there was also, as board members may recall in public, there was also a Stanford class of undergraduates that did a capstone class on planning in San Mateo County for sea level rise, and they did a presentation to the board. And then finally, there were other reports. These are listed here. They're hard to see, but from the state of California and the California Coastal Commission regarding sea level rise. So all of that information together in 2021 informed our work with the city of Burlingame staff and elected officials. I have to say that without Burlingame, probably we would not be at this place where we are today, because the leadership shown by the city council and the staff to actually get this done. And it was approved in December of 2021. And we're really grateful for that. So that led in 2022 to work with the cities of South San Francisco and San Mateo and San Carlos on different planning documents. In the case of South San Francisco, it was a general plan and a zoning ordinance. In the case of San Mateo and San Carlos, so far a general plan, and San Carlos is actually taking theirs up right now in regards to this issue, one of their general plan elements. That led us here today to the planning guidance policy that we put out last Wednesday and was in the board packet and sent out via a pretty broad newsletter email on Wednesday afternoon of last week. And our website for the effort is oneshoreline.org/planning-guidance. Okay, my final slide is on the Burlingame zoning ordinance, just to remind folks what that was about. The goal of that was to enable developments to both protect themselves and contribute to the broader resilience. And if people remember that we have kind of in tandem with the zoning ordinance, we have a project that we're working on with the cities of Burlingame and Millbrae that is tied into San Francisco International Airport. And so those two things really do go together. Burlingame was the first city in the Bay Area to incorporate into its zoning ordinance these kinds of requirements to support resilience. And the key elements, and you'll see this again when McKenna goes through the document, key elements include a buffer zone to give room for water, room for trails, room for ecosystem benefits. And in addition to the buffer zone, protection infrastructure requirements related to first floor elevations, stormwater, big issue, stormwater drainage, access and maintenance and real estate disclosures. That's what was in the Burlingame. Okay, so I'm going to turn it over to McKenna to talk about what is planning guidance policy.
All right, so what is the planning guidance policy? What does the document look like? So purpose of the policy is threefold. First, it's a standardized and evolving resource for, like Glenn mentioned, the jurisdictions, 12 cities in the county to account for climate-driven future conditions in 2 areas: their general plans, specific plans, and zoning ordinances, their planning documents, and then also in the review of specific new private developments. And that can happen today. You don't have to wait for a zoning update to do that. It's also intended to be a resource for anyone who wants to weigh in on land use planning and development along the Bay Shoreline in San Mateo County. So that could be advocacy organizations, environmental advocacy, housing advocacy, environmental justice. And we also hope that it's an example for other jurisdictions with similar challenges. Like Glenn mentioned, we've tapped into a lot of resources throughout the country to kind of pull together the recommendations in this document. And we hope this document kind of adds to that literature and pushes the conversation forward and how we can incorporate these requirements in a really tangible, meaningful way in our land use decisions. So what is this document and what is it not? That's also very important. So first, this document is voluntary guidance. It is something that One Shoreline is providing as a resource. It is, we do not have land use authority. It is not mandatory regulations. That is on the cities to kind of decide what they want to incorporate into their planning documents and their processes. So this is a reference document and it's voluntary. It is an actionable template. Shifting and incorporating your perspective to have future conditions included is a really big shift for cities. And so we're trying to make that as actionable and implementable as possible. This is not something that's we want to sit on a shelf. The language that you'll find in the document is like you'll see X's where cities can slot in like specific creeks or specific areas of their city that they want to apply it to. So very much trying to be as implementable and specific as possible. The document is focused primarily on new private development. So not existing development at this time and not necessarily public facilities. Sometimes the line between public and private can be blurry, especially in like the general plan language or stormwater drainage. I think impacts both areas, but right now, really the intent is focused on new private development and the implementation part of the document. And what we'll speak about today in terms of implementation is really focused on the private side, of development. And of course, this is an evolving document. We've learned a lot already, from the city of Burlingame incorporating these, requirements into their zoning. So this document is an iteration on that. It's already changed a bit from the zoning ordinance in Burlingame, and I think it will continue to evolve. This is not supposed to be static. Sea level rise science will also update. It will evolve with that, right? So it will continue to evolve. Okay, I'll walk you guys through the table of contents of the document. The opening pages, there's a preface cover letter, there's an orientation to how to use this document, and then an introduction of One Shoreline's Bay Protection Standard. Those first 4 pages, I think, are really key. They're like context setting for the whole document, why One Shoreline is developing this. So for you all, and then for the public, for anyone who's reviewing this document, I really encourage you to start here. Those first 4 pages are really, really important. Chapter 1 is focused on implementation. So what does it look like to implement the recommendations in the planning guidance policy, and how can One Shoreline support jurisdictions as they seek to implement it? So we'll go into a bit of detail in this chapter on One Shoreline's proposed role in providing jurisdictions with technical assistance as they look to do that, and how we can participate in local development review. Chapter 2, we start to get into the template language. So template language for general and specific plans. This is pretty high level policy language. It's meant for cities to slot into their goals, policies, and action sections of those documents. And then chapter 3 is really where we get specific. This is like the nitty gritty, really impactful, specific language intended for zoning ordinances. And we divide those recommendations into 2 different overlay districts. So one is a sea level rise overlay district intended for the geographies that are impacted by overland flooding. So that's water coming from San Francisco Bay overland, and also flooding from creeks. And then the shallow groundwater rise overlay district is intended for areas that are going to be facing hazards from below ground. So as shallow groundwater rises with sea level rise, there's relevant recommendations and provisions for those areas. We also divide, there's a lot of topics covered in this chapter, but these are, you like Len already spoke to. There's an applicability. So what are the project types and sizes where these provisions would apply to? I think it's really important to note that we do have exemptions largely for low density housing. So we aren't intending for these recommendations at this time to apply to single family homes, duplexes, triplexes. These are really intended for large scale commercial, industrial, and multifamily housing developments. We also, like Len mentioned, cover creek and bay buffer zones, 100 feet off of the bay front, as well as 35 feet off of top of bank on either side of creek. Shoreline protection requirement, I'll go into that a little bit later. Also have requirements related to elevating development, the first floor of a building, stormwater drainage, shallow groundwater, like I already mentioned. And then throughout, we've tried to weave in exceptions provisions. So where there are site-specific constraints and a project can't meet a certain provision as it's laid out, there's exceptions that we try to allow for flexibility. But of course, want to keep the project accountable to still providing resilience for their site and their neighbors. So there's a carve out kind of where they have to demonstrate that they're still providing resilience. Okay, and then chapters 4 and 5 kind of take all of that in chapter 3 and turn it into a checklist form for city staff to then apply those provisions in a specific review of a project. So like I mentioned before, they don't have to wait for the next zoning amendment update necessarily to implement this. They could, as they're reviewing a specific project for entitlement, they can take this and apply it to a checklist, and as they review that specific project, or conditions of approval as they issue permits and entitlements. Okay, so a key component of the planning guidance policy is One Shoreline's Bay Protection Standard. I think this is a really important topic to spend a little bit of time on. I'll introduce you all to what the standard is, and then what the level of protection it's intended to provide. And that can get kind of complicated, so bear with me. One Shoreline's desired, so the One Shoreline Bay Protection Standard is One Shoreline's desired elevation at the top of any new FEMA accredited shoreline protection infrastructure. And what is that elevation? It's the FEMA base flood elevation plus 6 feet. So the base flood elevation is the number that you would see on a FEMA map throughout the county. And the base flood elevation is what FEMA defines as the elevation of the bay water at an 100-year storm. That's a storm that has a chance of occurring, 1% chance of occurring in any year. Okay, so what does FEMA BFE +6 protect you from? I'm going to use this little schematic to try and walk through an example of what the level of protection this elevation provides. And I'm going to use 16 as the example bay protection standard. So let's just say at this part of the shoreline, the FEMA BFE is 10 feet, and then you add 6 to that, 16 feet, right? That's not 16 feet above the ground, the ground surface. It's 16 feet NAVD 88. That's just this vertical datum that we use when we go through project design. And so at this location, the bay protection standard, let's just say 16 feet. This is not necessarily the same thing as saying FEMA BFE +6 is not necessarily the same thing as saying it protects against 6 feet of sea level rise. We're trying to account for a lot of different hazards that impact the bay water level, sea level rise included, of course, but other things as well. And I'll just walk through that real quick. So, of course, we account for sea level rise in that number. That's the permanent but gradual increase in the bay water level over time. When storms occur, the bay water level goes up even more. There's storm surge, right? So as the storm comes in and a low pressure system comes in, the bay water level will go up even higher. When wind comes, that bay water level will increase. That's called storm surge. And then when that choppy water collides with the shoreline or collides with whatever protection infrastructure you might have, you have wave run up. So that additional increase in the water level when it collides with whatever is on the shoreline at that location. So for this example, we have 3 feet of sea level rise, storm surge, and wave run up, and all of that is accounted for in a 16-foot example elevation. Okay, so that's on a stormy day. And then the same 16 feet, let's just say at this location on a very calm day, can account for 9 feet of sea level rise, right? Because you don't have those other dynamics of storm surge and all of that. So maybe not to get too much in the weeds, maybe I've already done that, but just to illustrate that the elevation is not tied to a specific sea level rise scenario. It's actually just a number that we set, and then it can protect from multiple different scenarios, all of them pretty forward thinking. So from 3 feet at this location, for example, to 9 feet of wide range. Another important takeaway about this number is the type of shoreline infrastructure that you build has a really significant impact on how it performs. So let's just take the same 16 feet. If you have the gradual levee, that's somewhat illustrated on that top image, that's supposed to illustrate a gradual slope. Let's just say you're really constrained at that location and you have to build a vertical seawall and you don't have any room to do any sort of gradual slope. When waves collide with a vertical seawall, your wave run up is much higher. The waves will travel much higher. And so as a result, and in this example, you can get up to 19.5 feet above the datum. And so the 16 feet will account for some of it, but not all of the wave run up. So not only is a gradual sloped piece of infrastructure good for people, for public access, for views, for ecosystems, you can incorporate natural elements into it, but it's also really important for flood protection. You can lower the amount of waves that you'll see when you have a gradual slope.
Maybe I'll just add, McKenna, that's one of the reasons you want a buffer zone, is if you don't have a buffer zone and you build right up to the shoreline, you have no choice but to put a wall, and that is kind of a feedback loop, a negative feedback loop, forcing you then to build the wall higher and higher as the wave run up increases.
Right.
Thanks.
Yeah. So yeah, that's a bit about the 1 shoreline bay protection standard. And how does this actually get implemented in the guidance? The perspective of the document is that this is the responsibility of developers. So you'll see in chapter 3 in that zoning text, we are recommending that new private development projects that front the bay include shoreline infrastructure in their development that is built to the full bay protection standard, or they provide space with the buffer zone, as Len mentioned, and land rights that enable the local jurisdiction, either the city or county, or 1 shoreline to build to the full bay protection standard later. So this is a key part of the document. This is just one provision out of many, but I think it's a really important one, obviously. So I wanted to highlight that. Okay, another aspect of the document is the map of future conditions. This is a separate online map that is meant to accompany the planning guidance policy. It's available on the website. You can scan a little QR code on the slides as well. It's a pretty simple map. There's 3 layers. One illustrates one shoreline's bay protection standard for the whole bay shoreline. Then there's the sea level rise overlay district, shallow groundwater rise overlay district. Go into those for a second. The bay protection standard layer allows you to click at any point along the shoreline, and then on the left side, you see the top left there, the bay protection standard value for that location will pop up, and you can, so that's a way for developers to see what the proposed standard will be at that location. Sea level rise overlay district illustrates the area that we deem vulnerable to overland flooding, and that should be subject to the relevant zoning requirements that are in that chapter, chapter 3. Shallow groundwater rise is a similar thing, but related to what we deem as vulnerable to subsurface hazards due to shallow groundwater increasing.
I should say, and if the jurisdictions or anyone looking at these has questions about how did they come up with this
Yeah.
map, or what's this, there are links to all of this information. Like, for example, the shallow groundwater rise map, that's a USGS map.
Yeah, and
US Geological Survey.
and all of that text that's hard to read now, but
Yeah.
you have the map in front of you. A lot of that explains and links the resources to it. This is based on USGS modeling. I want to highlight 2 areas that are especially emerging and dynamic right now that would require some more detailed follow-up work. We have some template provisions in the guidance, but it really is a first step and there's a lot more work needed. One is stormwater drainage. We've seen the impacts of stormwater flooding this last year, but there isn't a very good understanding on how increases in precipitation should inform sizing and retention requirements in stormwater. People haven't quite connected that yet, and we don't have a lot of technical information specific to San Mateo County that speaks to that. We tried to stitch together what we did have. We reviewed existing city codes and what cities currently require, and then looked at some studies that look at increases in precipitation due to climate change, but there's still work needed. And so I've been in conversations with CCAG, and I think there's more needed with the cities in the county to kind of scope a larger effort where we can update stormwater provisions throughout the county and really account in a meaningful way for how climate will impact our rainfall. The other area is shallow groundwater rise. You might be familiar with the new report that came out earlier this year, authored by SFEI and shallow groundwater. All the takeaways from that report are tried to be woven into this policy. But they're mostly high level. We don't have a lot of the really specific data to make some key decisions. And so at this point, a lot of that template language remains high level and I think can continue to evolve as the science evolves.
There's a PhD graduate student at Stanford that specializes in groundwater, and she's going to be working with us to help to develop specific maps for each city.
So our planning for City of Burlingame, we just decided to prioritize water recycling and stormwater disbursement as 2 of our top priorities. So I think our staff's gonna start working on that pretty seriously. I think we talked about this. And so maybe we can loop you guys in on that conversation too. So we're not, we can, whatever we're doing, we can make sure that you guys are on board with what it is. So I think it's all 3 of these. It's gonna be.
And we can help push it out to everybody else.
And then you can help push it out. Exactly. We might as well. Let us be the, hey, Mikey, can you try that?
Well, thank you.
You're welcome.
I'll pass it on. I'll talk a bit about how we developed the document itself.
Good afternoon, I'm Kelly Beggs, I'm a principal planner for the city company. I'm very pleased to be before you this afternoon, and we're very excited to work on this very important document. So I'll take a few moments to discuss the process that led us to develop the document and some of the source material. Lynn already described some of it, so I won't take too long. But we started with a really close review of all of the local policies for those 12 shoreline San Mateo County jurisdictions, as well as for the County of San Mateo, just to really understand the context and what regulations already exist related to flooding, sea level rise, and climate change. As you can imagine, especially in the general plans, the age of the document really affected if those policies and regulations were present or not. And then we also did a broad review towards some cities around the United States, to really see more about what kind of the context, and the national, policies were. As Lynn described, we are lucky to have a lot of example policies and regulations and general plans and zoning ordinances in our area, specifically Burlingame and South San Francisco. So those were really key to developing this document. And if you look at those zoning codes, those general plans, you'll see a lot of familiarity between this document and those. And then in chapter 3 of the guidance document policy, is the zoning text amendment. The city of Boston also has established a coastal flood resilience overlay district. We pulled elements from there. And then the groundwater rise overlay district is really closely connected to the document that McKenna talked about earlier. So a really important part of our process already has been a lot of outreach to local agencies. So when we prepared a preliminary draft of the document, we did distribute that to all 12 shoreline jurisdictions, as well as to several agencies listed here, including San Mateo County, BCDC, CCAG, San Francisco Estuary Institute, and then we also had additional reviewers. We received over 300 comments from that process, and we really carefully reviewed each comment, responded to the comments, and then incorporated a lot of changes into the document. So the document that you see today has really been through a pretty robust amount of vetting already, and has already been seen by a lot of the interested parties. The comments really ranged in terms of what people were focused on. We had a lot of questions about applicability, and kind of talked about what kind of development that this would refer to. A lot of interest in how we could start applying this to capital project planning, which is something that One Shoreline will be offering at another document. As we mentioned, this document is really focused on kind of substantial private development. Interest in how existing development should be treated, potentially retrofitted or protected by shoreline infrastructure. Equity was really top of mind in how we can prioritize those vulnerable groups. And then how different kinds of residential development should be treated. We also had a lot of interest in site grading and how we can integrate these sites, which will be elevated to protect them from sea level rise, into an existing context. And then public access was also really top of mind for a lot of reviewers, as well as the One Shoreline Protection Standard, which McKenna just did a great job of describing here. So the last bullet point there was implementation, and that will obviously be a really key part of this document. McKenna mentioned this is supposed to be an actionable template. And what we really tried to provide here is something that people can really take it and run with it. However, of course, there will be more work to do on behalf of local jurisdictions. So of course, what we would recommend is that any local jurisdiction review the guidance policy again, or for the first time, had they not yet seen it. And then people will really have to contextualize it and study the local extents of those districts and understand the context. Lynn showed in an earlier slide some of the GIS analysis that we prepared, and going into this, we had really assumed that most of the Bayfront was zoned commercial industrial. And that's really just not the case. In different jurisdictions, the land uses are much more dispersed than what we originally thought. So we think that it will be really important, and we do hope to distribute some of that analysis to the jurisdictions to help to kind of build that context. Of course, we recommend that people conduct community outreach. These jurisdictions are, of course, experts in their own built environments and really understand, and their citizens also experts in that field. And then integrating the template policies into the general plans and the zoning text amendments will be really important. We have left kind of access, McKenna mentioned, for people to be able to input their own information. So if someone has a review threshold from another chapter of their zoning code, we want for them to be able to replicate that and really tie in these policies and procedures into their existing ordinances. Of course, staff will need to take these policy and zoning text amendment changes to local decision makers. And then adopting policies and regulations as either a standalone initiative or in concert with whatever planned amendments they have going on right now. Part of the either planned or just happy coincidence of the timing is that many jurisdictions, as you all know, have recently completed their housing elements. And then there are a lot of zoning code updates and general plan updates, especially to the safety element that have to follow. So the hope is that these could tie into those existing efforts. And I'll pass it back to McKenna.
I'll speak briefly about One Shoreline's role in all of that. So primarily on technical assistance, we can provide technical assistance to the cities and county as they go through that implementation process in the form of presenting to their city councils, to other governing bodies and commissions, providing any data, like Kelly mentioned, related to vulnerabilities and vulnerable areas in that specific jurisdiction, and the land use types and all of that. And then we can also review the actual documents. We've already done this, as we've mentioned multiple times before, but we're still very much available and happy to do it. So providing comments on any long-range planning initiatives, and then even specific designs of projects or proposed projects that the city is reviewing. That's an example is shown there on the side of a safety element that we received, and we just track changes and add comments to it. So it can be as simple as that. And of course, as with all aspects of the planning guidance policy, including One Shoreline in the planning process, and project review is voluntary on behalf of the jurisdictions. We're really seeking to be a resource for jurisdictions. We don't want to add to that burden. Like I said, this is going to be a huge perspective shift for jurisdictions, and we want to make that as implementable as possible and support cities and the county as they seek to make that shift. I'll pass it to you.
Yeah, so the next steps for this document.
Yeah.
Next steps for this document are during a 30-day public comment period that started April 19th and ends May 19th. We have on May 9th at noon a online public, what we call a public information feedback session, and information on how to register for it is on our website. And our web page, our homepage has information about this, as well as there are portions of our website, so it's pretty easy to find how to do that. So there is a public comment period that ends on May 19. Our next board meeting is May 22nd. We intend to come back with this item and just talk about the public comments that were received on it during that 30-day public comment period, solicit any additional input from the board or the public that day on May 22nd. And then our objective is to bring it back to the board as a final draft for board approval on June 22nd. June 26th, our board meeting during the month of June. So I believe that concludes presentation, this agenda item, and we'd be happy to answer questions.
Thank you for that presentation. It's an incredible body of work, really groundbreaking. I hope it'll have a big influence on the 12 jurisdictions. So come back to my colleagues for comments and questions. Yes.
Thank you very much, Chair Pine. I noticed in reading the document that there are these. First of all, I really like the way it's laid out. You guys have made it incredibly easy to read. It's not just this boring wilderness thing. There's these wonderful little suggestions and things on the side that make it really fun. I don't know whose idea that was, the one or anything. Anyway, one of them was sort of this impact fee notion, like we do with housing, and we didn't incorporate that into our work, but I really liked it. And I'm curious if you have any thoughts or studies about there's obviously a nexus, but do we need to get a nexus study then to implement those kinds of fees? And sort of what do you think, could those be in lieu of, sort of a tax? They're obviously project specific, so you either do the work or you pay us the fees and we do the work, just like you do with housing. Like what would the level of fees be? Is it per square foot, per project, specific to the zone that they're developing in? How would you do that?
Well, I would start off, you all add too, that those are all great questions and they're unknowns. And so these impact fees, or in some some spheres are called mitigation fees
Mhm.
also. That's also, that question is also related to the question of One Shoreline's potential funding moving
Mhm.
forward, right? How does that relate? Because if a lot of these projects like at Burlingame Millbrae or One Shoreline projects, then we want to be thinking ahead about what's the funding stream for that work for both the agency and for the project. So these fees are project by project. So One Shoreline's role could be to kind of knit together a strategy for multiple projects within a city, or more likely multiple cities, and how those fees make sense for developers as they look at the different sites to develop within the county. Right? So those are all good questions, and I think what we were trying to do, I'll turn it over to Kenna and Kelly. Well, I think what we were trying to do is just introduce the idea as something that should be explored either by us at One Shoreline or by cities individually as they think about how to account for the true cost of these developments and how some of these developments, as they're upzoned or otherwise are provided with a substantial benefit, how that can be returned to that city.
So to colleagues, this is really important because, I'm working on a development agreement with this developer right now, and they're, trying to call all the mitigation work they're doing a community benefit and get credit for that as community benefit. And so I think stepping in with this like line of demarcation around these are fees and this is the baseline from which we're gonna expect you to perform, then that takes a little bit of that out of the realm of community benefit. And then you can get true, it is, but it sets the baseline. Developers then know they have to incorporate it in their pro forma. If we quantify it, with some alternative structure of cost, and we may be able to give you that by looking at, the developer right now is doing for us an analysis of the delta between, what they would have built and then what they're building to accommodate this. And we'll know that number, and then we can look at per acre, per square foot, per linear foot, and then we'll have an idea of what that was. And that might serve as a really good basis for Nexus on future developments as an alternative if someone doesn't want to do the work to pay the fees. So stay posted on that as that comes. And then I think it allows you also to understand, now you have to contribute to grade separation and this and that, and they're looking at us like, well, we already did all this, we're doing it for Bayfront. And we're like, well, you're kind of doing that for your property, save your value, and this is for the community, which you're also going to impact. So I think it would give us a really cleaner way to negotiate with these developers in a standardized manner throughout the county. Already, answering your question.
Follow up on that.
Yeah.
Thank you, Donna, I appreciate that. I mean, we recently did some vision documents and some planning documents that we changed our baseline requirements in San Carlos for some of the developments going in. So I think adding that to it, I think would be super helpful for us to include, because I like the idea of changing the baseline, right? And
Yeah.
because it's not a benefit, it's a must do versus it's a nice to do. I'd love to see it as you get through that process.
I think it's great. And then the development zoning change is really how we're letting them pay for that, right? When we zoned. And then the conversation that's been hard with the community is the community keeps coming back to us going, we want to squish these buildings down and make them flat and fat all over the site. And we're like, no, you want to go tall and small so we can have these other benefits. So it could be helpful to educate the community to why upzoning and bigger FARs are important in order to understand how this is all going to lay out on the property. But I'll be happy to share that. And when we get that DA, it'll be obviously a public document. So you'll be able to see that, and Michael Gina and Kevin Gardner can help you with that and the understanding of how that all broke down.
And to get to a point that Director Rack mentioned, I think it's helpful for cities to have in place a zoning ordinance that they can kind of, rely on for that conversation. For sure.
Part and parcel of all of that, to probably be good to have an analysis, of just how high you go so that the community benefit next to it can be open space protected, so that you don't have a blanket wall of massing along the shoreline. So a community that's looking at that can say, if we give this much, that adds to the ability to have some open space next to the development that's paying for the wall.
We can, and of course it will be different, right? So we have an airport FAA issue, so we can't go that high, so we were already low. So a city like East Palo Alto that might be already higher, it's gonna be the increment around it, and we can figure out what that sort of increment, 20% increase or 5 stories or whatever.
But that community benefit can be, that's where the community benefit comes in.
Exactly, exactly.
And I think Burlingame zoning ordinance actually does a nice job of tying the increased FARs to increased community benefits. So that's another good example to look at.
Yes. Okay. That's great.
Can we also talk about, so we're talking about 12 cities, but there are a few of us that are here. How are we reaching out to the other cities that aren't in the room to make sure that they're aware and their voices are heard?
Yeah, so I can start actually. Okay, we did just review this document already to all 12 jurisdictions and to the county. And we received really good feedback from 10 of those jurisdictions. So they have already been aware of, reviewed pretty much in detail the document. I believe McKenna has also redistributed them after in anticipation of this meeting as well.
Okay.
And then I believe that the other intent of this public information feedback session that we're holding on May 9th is to reincorporate and to give folks more time to attend and to comment and to be available for questions and answers.
I always think about that as I represent the southern end, making sure that the cities that I'm representing are at the table and know that they should be commenting by a certain time. And then for communities that may have already approved the general plan, but they didn't include like this portion, the environmental justice portion, what are the recommendations for those cities as well?
I have heard that there's an environmental justice, you might be more familiar with this than I am, but there's environmental justice element, that update that's going on, or even created for the first time. I don't think there's ever been an EJ element before. And so the county is working on one, and then they have some coalition of cities that are going under contract with them to get that update, and that's coming up. I think it's kicking off this spring. So yeah, that's something that interested in East Palo to get involved in too. That's a separate general plan update element.
Thank you.
Sort of parlaying on Director Gauthier's question here. Not only is this relevant to San Mateo County, but Alameda, San Francisco, Marin, possibly Sonoma, Napa, the 9 area counties. Are we looking to maybe make a presentation at ABAG, or how are we reaching out to other counties? Because why reinvent the wheel? We've done hard work, and I really also just want to recognize Len's incredibly gracious and this board's support of his work, reaching out to specifically Marin County and helping them get funding, and they're starting on this similar project, and their vulnerabilities are incredibly complex over there too, because then we'll learn things from them and they'll share back with us. So are we thinking about that and what the next?
So part of our district, we distributed this through the newsletter very broadly, and part of that distribution list specifically was to basically our counterparts at all of the cities around the Bay, and there are other forums for flood control agencies or these types of agencies, and so we're going to be distributing them.
Yeah, perfect.
And yes, and we send it to ABAG, and certainly ECDC has been very involved. They have a Bay Adapt program that involves all the jurisdictions. And anyway, there's a very long list that.
Thank you.
Yeah.
That's terrific. I really appreciate it.
Yeah, and also nonprofits, like Greenbelt Alliance and Spur, which is a planning organization in San Francisco, and the Nature Conservancy and Actera and all the regulatory agencies here in this county, groups like Green Lining Institute, Thrive, the Bay Trail program. So we really tried to, I think, brainstorm a good list of folks that think not just for our local jurisdiction.
Thank you.
Sure.
I'd like to add, on top of that, I would send it to like the legislative analyst's office. And also the various resource committee consultancies. The Green Caucus. I think we want to elevate it to the legislature. Looking forward to future legislation and funding through the bond, et cetera. So I would extend that all the way to Sacramento. Including, you know, Mr. Laird, who you cite one of his bills in here about doing the planning. So I think we need to extend it all the way to the state legislature. Strategic Growth Council. There's also a sea level rise select committee in the assembly that has presentations throughout the year on marquee sorts of issues, and you know, send it to some of those committees too that are in the little red book. Share that with you. I think, you know, I'm not affected and have been by this or Pacific or Daly City, but I think it's amazingly ambitious. I think it's really well executed. It was a wonderful read, I think, along with the map. So, One Shoreline being a leader on a perspective shift, I think is great. It's a great role for us. So thank you for all the hard work we've put into it. I think it's just.
That's well put. It's really is a perspective shift.
I think it also really highlights out the critical importance of us to do what you mentioned, Len, which is figure out how we're going to fund this agency into perpetuity, and what the funding source and mechanism is going to be on this, whether it's city funded or tax funded or parcel tax or state fund or grant, I don't know, but I think we have to probably sit down and start thinking about that again.
This is real value added for the cities.
Yeah.
So that's a selling point
It
in
is.
terms of future funding, I think.
Yeah.
And we talked previously about maybe having to do some technical assistance with permitting. But I think, you know, this role is a really good one for laying the ground for future funding, for sure.
Maybe we should do a present, several of you are on the CCAG board, maybe we should do a presentation for the CCAG board.
Council of Cities dinner, you know.
You did one. They did it at Burlingame. But we can do it again?
We could figure out how the leadership group can also help get in front of some of the businesses as well. That might be a round table or something that we can do.
Chambers of Commerce maybe is also another good place.
All right. Really good comments, great report. Thank you for your hard work.
Thank you.
Super impressed.
There any public comment?
Mr. Chair.
Yes, let's check for public comment.
Thank you, Mr. Chair. Members of the public, if you wish to comment on item 4A, please do raise your hand now. And just for the record, we do have Directors Mueller and Rack present. Okay, so I see 3 hands raised. First, we'll go with Margaret Bruce, followed by Carla Ann Young. Margaret, you'll have 2 minutes, so please proceed.
Thank you, everyone, and members of the board and Len and staff. First off, the JPA would like to congratulate all of you on this fantastic accomplishment. I think it goes without saying that this is going to be a leadership example across the state and likely far beyond and beyond sea level rise. So congratulations. And this is a really stellar accomplishment. I just want to say that the JPA will comment and is very happy to provide whatever support or assistance we can, and that would be helpful. Again, congratulations, everyone.
Thank you, Margaret. Our next speaker is going to be Carlisle Anyang, followed by Geeta Dev. Carlisle, you'll have 2 minutes. Please proceed.
Thank you. Again, I'm on the coast side, but I was interested in watching this presentation. And it does sound to me, since I live in Moss Beach, and there's been a horrible flooding coming out of Quarry Park, which is a 500-acre San Mateo County Parks Department park. And it flows down several streets and then out to the ocean. And there's another nonprofit that's planning a 71-unit complex in Moss Beach, and they're updating their EIR now, but their original EIR said they plan to have some retention ponds on the property, but if they had an overflow, that would flow into Montera Creek, which goes right out to the Pacific Ocean and the marine reserve. So I have a big concern about that. And I think if the county would make a ordinance that said they can't release their stormwater into a public right of way, water, such as the Bayside or the Pacific Ocean, that would go a long way with getting your people who are planning new development to, do the right thing and not just dump their water down a culvert that eventually goes straight out to the ocean. Thank you.
Thank you, Carlisle. Okay, our next speaker will be Geeta Dev. At this time, I would like to make the last call for folks to raise their hand on item 4A. Okay, Geeta, you'll have 2 minutes, so please proceed.
Good afternoon. This is Geeta Dev again. I'm with the Sierra Club Loma Prieta chapter. I forgot to mention that last time. I wanted to raise an issue and ask a question of the board and the staff, something that Member Gautier raised about the issue of environmental justice and whether that could be incorporated into the policy document somehow. It occurs to, I think, me and probably a lot of people that when one protects new developments with levee structures, whether they are nature-based on the outside in the sense that they have a longer slope or not, that they are actually preventing water from getting onto their land, sea level rise. And as the Stanford studies have shown, that water will go elsewhere. And from the justice point of view, it'll either go into other communities that are not protected, or it will, in fact, drown tidal wetlands that also are not protected and affect the health of the entire bay. So from a resilience point of view and a justice point of view, I'm wondering if somehow cities could incorporate into their policies something which says that if you prevent water from coming into your property up to a certain height, that water is going elsewhere, and somehow you need to compensate for that by providing space elsewhere within the city to receive that water. So I'm wondering about that. And the other item is that when levees are built, they can be built on firm ground or on bay mud, depending on where they are built. Depending if it's built on bay mud, they need to be much wider and they will sink. And in high liquefaction zones, these earthen levees have been known to fail. They just slump when they liquefy. So I'm wondering if somehow that could be worked into the policy document somewhere where there's a difference between how it should be buffered against high liquefaction areas, bay mud versus firm ground. Thank you so much. I really appreciate the wonderful work that's being done here. Thank you, everyone.
Thank you, Geeta. Mr. Chair, we have one other speaker. Shall I go ahead and call on him?
Yes, please.
Okay. Our last speaker for this item will be Samuel Casillas. Samuel, you have 2 minutes, so please proceed.
Hello, yeah, I wasn't going to speak until I heard the spokesperson from the Sierra Club and have to completely agree. When I was shocked when you did part of that presentation when you mentioned, well, when you have no other choices other than the seawall, and then you have to take into account to build it higher. Not only was there that Stanford study, but then also Gary Griggs down at Santa Cruz has done all this, and you must be aware of all his work that he's done. When you build a seawall, that water actually goes somewhere else. That force goes somewhere else. It's not going to go over the top. I mean, eventually it will. But the fact is that here in Pacifica, what we're up against when we're considering the seawall is the fact that it's going to devastate the beaches. So my first question was actually going to be, if this is the route that you guys are going, how aligned are you with the Coastal Act and the coastal policies set in forth there? Because of the fact that the first priority and law of the Coastal Act is to protect our shoreline resources, which also affects environmental justice, because places like Pacifica are places where folks from all around the region and underserved communities actually come to first to enjoy the beaches and the recreation here. So there's a lot that we need to consider here. And I get it. Nobody wants to talk about managed retreat, but it's either managed retreat or emergency evacuation. We just got to figure out how to get there and come up with some policies that take everything into consideration, because it's not going to be pretty. And the Coastal Act is not going to allow to destroy beaches or other communities with the impact and force of that water going somewhere else. Thank you very much. I look forward to working with you guys in some way if I could.
Thank you, Mr. Casillas. That was the end of public comment, Mr. President. Oh, Mr. Chair, back to you.
Thank you. Did you have a comment, Lynn?
Yeah, actually, I have a comment, and I'm going to turn it over to McKenna to make a comment regarding Gita Dev's point on environmental justice. So the comment I would make is in response to Mr. Casillas, and that is really two things. One is this document is for the Bayside cities, rather than the cities of Half Moon Bay or Daly City or Pacifica on the coast, or unincorporated county areas on the coast side. And the document goes into a little bit of discussion about why we're focusing on the Bayside cities at this point. The Bayside cities and the coastside, Bayside areas and coastside areas, have different issues and threats and kind of just environments, both in terms of what they're exposed to, and erosion being the principal issue on the coast side, but also environment in terms of the regulatory regime. And Mr. Casillas is speaking to that regulatory regime and the role of the Coastal Commission, which is different than the role of BCDC on the Bayside. So for this document, we're focused on the Bayside. In terms of managed retreat, there is a small discussion of this topic in the planning guidance policy in one of the blue boxes that Director Colson mentioned. And we're not, I would say we're not kind of shying away from that conversation, but we are acknowledging that there's a lot of development that's been built, and that the land is of incredibly high value. And we didn't feel at this time for this document that we could propose a large scale retreat. So what we did do through these buffer zone approaches for both the shoreline and for the creeks is to say, let's set ourselves back as much as is practical. Let's align that with, in the case of the shoreline, with the state requirements that are administered by BCDC. And let's use those buffer zones or setbacks as a way to increase room for water. And as I mentioned before, room for habitat and environment. And so it doesn't say long-term, we won't have to move back further, but it does say that this is a good start in which to protect ourselves and provide additional room under the regime that we're in now, whereby coming out with a document that prescribes large-scale managed retreat probably would not have gone anywhere at this point, for better or worse. That's just how it is. And so what we are trying to do is the best job we can to, let's say, retreat towards the landward side, both along creeks and And I'll turn it over to McKenna to talk about the environmental justice piece.
Yeah, I'll actually, can I tag team that real
Sure.
quick too? I think just, it's important to clarify that the point of that slide of having that schematic with the levee and the seawall, the takeaway should definitely not be that the seawall is the preferred approach there. It's showing that actually, it's very much not, and you have to deal with higher waves as a result of that. So at all costs, you should avoid trying to armor both the bay shoreline and on the coast side to the greatest extent you can. And there's some provisions in the document that really emphasize the importance of natural infrastructure and incorporating that into shoreline protection to the greatest extent practicable. So there's very strong language in the planning guidance policy that speak to that and the importance of that, not only for human enjoyment of the shoreline and access of the shoreline, but also for preserving the habitats and ecosystems along the shoreline. So just to emphasize that. And then to speak to Gita covered a lot in her comment on environmental justice. There is a section in the general plan template language chapter, so that's chapter 2, that has some environmental justice related language, pretty high level, but I think really focus on trying to center communities and have community-led sea level rise adaptation planning and have that be in these policy documents that are adopted by cities so that it directs the way that cities undergo their adaptation planning. That's super important and very related to these provisions, as the commenter pointed out. So I would refer them to that chapter and would welcome feedback on that chapter. We've incorporated a lot of comments from BCDC on that. They have a lot of expertise in that area too, and would welcome more comments. On the whole issue of site grading and like pushing water to different properties, that has been a really messy topic that we've wrestled with a lot in the development of this document. And one area where we try to account for it is there's a compensatory storage provision in the stormwater section of chapter 3. So not to get too nitty gritty, but I would refer the commenter to that area that tries to have private developers be accountable to any additional water that they would push off-site. They have to compensate for that with additional storage on their site. And that's really a practice that a lot of cities have already undertaken when they go through a development review and they have their conditions of approval of a permit. That's what I heard from cities and I turned it into a provision. So it's something that's already in practice and that's one way we're trying to account for that, but it is a messy question. And then the final point was liquefaction. I don't know if you have anything to say on that either, but the shallow groundwater rise overlay district tries to account for areas that are subject to liquefaction. The low-lying areas all along the bay, especially on Bayville, are really subject to that. For now, it's fairly high level. So speaking to my slide earlier where there's a need for probably iterations on that, I think that's one of them, but there's some area of the document accounting for that. So.
Thank you. So that concludes public comment. I think that concludes this item.